Willow Bay Waypoint. Chapter 2. I woke up before the first signs of dawn and rushed about my room as quietly as I could. I stumbled and fumbled to put myself together, but it was kinda tough in the dim light of a single candle. Finally, after looking myself over a little more closely through the flickering glow, I crept down the creaking staircase. My mother had left a small package on the kitchen table. Probably a little cake wrapped in brown paper, but there was a small note attached, and I couldn't quite read it through the molasses dark, so I stuffed the whole thing into my satchel with a smile and slipped through the front door. My heart was racing, thumping against its cage with excitement as I passed over the cold cobblestone, and by the time I had closed the distance between me and Buck's Waypoint, I could hardly catch my breath. The street lamps flickered in the first strands of dawn as I looked down a street I'd crossed over more times than I could count, while on my way to the meadows beyond the front gates. It was one of my favorite places, and yet I'd always taken this street for granted. Until now. I took a deep breath and released it in a sigh as I stepped off the sidewalk toward the final stretch. Buck's a good man. You made a good impression, kid. Don't mess that up. A new sensation crept in with my father's parting words. I gulped back sudden nerves and blinked toward the single lighted window across the cobblestone road. What if I'm not good at it? What if I let them both down in one foul swoop? The question slithered in as I glanced toward the morning star, still twinkling and dancing above me. What if I fail on the very first day? I stuffed my hands into my pockets and rocked back and forth from heel to toe. What if? What if? What if? I found my feet leading me around the back side of the buildings and away from the front entrance of the waypoint. Another lap won't hurt anything. Besides, Buck hadn't really said when I was supposed to show up, and it would be better to go into the first day on the right note than to enter in with expectations that didn't serve my purpose for being there. I wanted to be the best apprentice ever, and the best apprentice is someone who can assist without fear. I reminded myself of these and other wise words my father had given to me the night before. I'll be great. I'm going to be really good at this. I repeated the phrase over and over again as I walked from streetlight to streetlight over the abandoned cobblestone. How hard could it be? I kicked at a loose rock and watched it bounce and skip to a stop in the middle of the stone street, just as I rounded the final bend in the block, leading me back to the first stretch I had been avoiding. A cool breeze flowed in, bringing with it a new detail. A new smell on the wind. It nearly stopped me in my tracks. I took in a deep breath. The air suddenly seemed warmer, and on the light breeze trickling past me was the most wonderful smell I can remember experiencing. The scent of warm yeast and sweet cinnamon, and warm butter cascaded in, filling me from every side. I felt my feet being drawn in by it, leading me ever closer to the front of the waypoint I'd first set out toward. My new apprenticeship. Halfway down the block I stopped and closed my eyes for another deep breath. It smelt delicious. I opened them again, ready to follow my nose to the source, when a small shadow slipped from the entrance of the waypoint inn. The heavy wooden sign above swayed slightly as the door closed loudly behind the red-hooded figure who'd leaked from it. The shadow's cape flowed out behind the shaded figure as it rushed in the opposite direction without seeing me. I watched curiously as it retreated toward the front gate, and then beyond, following the cobblestone into the dirt path I'd traveled along more times than I cared to remember. Finally, I shook myself free from the image of a map and where the mysterious person might be off to, and why. "You're gonna be late." The thought kicked me into gear. I rushed over the finals fence and flung the door open as the first crack of dawn traveled along behind me. I was met with warmth. The crackling fire welcomed me as something bubbled in the cauldron above it. It almost sounded like it was laughing as it bubbled into the friendly ambience. I already loved the place. The surroundings offered my eyes a buffet of beautiful wood carvings, while my nose greedily took in the same smell that had met me down the block. The clatter of pans drew my eyes to the double swinging doors at the other side of the parlor. "Buck?" I waited for a response before letting my eyes graze over the hand-carved tables. The one closest to me was held up by a massive wooden black bear. His paws and powerful wooden claws gleamed at either side of the table, frozen in place like he was holding it up. I walked closer, squinting to get a better look. Whoa. The expression slid naturally from my lips as I soaked in the details. I wonder if he carved all of these. Along the edge of the bar top, acting as a partition between the high top tables I was currently surrounded in, and the low round tables beyond, was ornamented in all kinds of lizards and turtles and other small creeping critters. The chairs pushed in along the base of the bar featured a larger representation of the animal closest to it. One stool looked like the shell of a tortoise. Another's seat back seemed like a large lizard curled around the outer edge of a pollywog. I smiled as I drug my finger over the turtle's top, enjoying the texture and thinking of the tortoises I'd seen making their cumbersome way over the face of the valley at various times in previous years, though I hadn't seen any recently. "Good morning, Master Chester." Buck's voice boomed through the parlor as he burst from the swinging doors. He wiped his hands on a drying cloth before tossing it over his burly shoulder. "You're late," he laughed as I nearly leapt out of my skin to spin to face him fully. I'm sorry, sir," I called back, still flustered. "I took the long way. I needed fresh air," I finished more quietly. My cheeks warmed as he clapped a hearty hand on my shoulder. "We all have a first day somewhere, kid. I understand completely." Buck used his free hand to wipe a drip of sweat from his brow. "It's no matter, though. But little Ness was a bit sore she had to do the errand I'd meant for you to do this morning." He winked a twinkling eye. The flash of the shadow figure I'd seen scurrying over the cobblestone pushed its way to the front of my mind. "If you hurry, you might be able to catch her still. She can introduce you to our best customer, in fact. That's a great idea." I blinked back my surprise and confusion. Yes, sir." "That's a good lad. Here, I'll give you an extra bundle of fresh goods. You and the little lass can enjoy them on the way back from your trip. Get you back in her good graces." "Where exactly am I going, Buck, sir?" "Just Buck, kiddo, and you'll follow the path out the front gate, all the way to the forest, and keep going until you see the cottage in the clearing. You can't miss it." I blinked again. I'd never been past the forest's edge. Buck cocked his head to the side. "That is, if you're all right making the journey on your own." Buck lifted a challenging eyebrow as the grin grew over his face. "Yeah, I can do that just fine." I straightened myself. "Great," he boomed, turning back toward the kitchen. I hesitated and then followed after, my heart still racing, with equal part nerves and excitement. It's the first day on the job, and I'm already doing something I've never done. It's exactly what I'd wanted. His smile was contagious, and the smell of fresh, sweet cinnamon washed away all sense of uncertainty as we passed into the kitchen. The place was blooming with steam from all corners. It billowed from 3 bubbling cauldrons, hovering over the large hearth that took up the whole back wall. Buck made a beeline toward them while I took in the surroundings. "So the sweet rolls and donuts are on the main counter, boy. Go ahead and take 2. 1 for each of you, and wrap them in that brown paper there." He pointed to a roll hoisted between 2 poles that held it in place. "It'll keep 'em fresh. Now hurry up and be on your way. That little Ness is a quick one, and she's already hot in the head from having to do your chore." I could hear his smile, though his back was to me. So I set about the task, looking the steaming rolls over hungrily. My mouth nearly watered as I chose 2 chocolate donuts and carefully packaged them. Buck turned and nodded his approval. "Those are her favorites. You have a good eye, boy. Now off with ya." I did as I was told, tossing the 2 packages into my satchel. Into the satchel I hadn't had time to set down yet. Already I'd forgotten my mom's parting gift, and the note in my excitement. Within another minute or 2, I was off, down the street, as the lamplighter snuffed the first of the lights along the way leading from the... Within another minute or 2, I was off, down the street, on my way to a great adventure, as the lamplighter snuffed the first of the lights along the way leading to the front gate. The cobblestone turned to dirt after I passed the first rolling hills. The path was so fine and worn in from use, I could see little clouds of dust puffing up in the wake of each step I took, like little clouds chasing after my footfalls. The gathering dawn yawned brilliant orange and purples and pinks in all directions. The grass and flowers swayed to life over the sea of meadows. A light breeze brushed against my skin, sending ripples through the meadow grass, like waves over water. I swung my arms as I rushed through, pretending to swim through them, but stopped at the thought that my new accomplice might turn and see me acting foolishly, and tell Buck to get rid of me for playing foolishly on the job. I ran faster, swinging my arms naturally to the motion instead. The sun had risen over the forest line, and my palms and forehead had begun to sweat by the time I turned again to look back at the retreating city. It was smaller than I normally saw it. From this view, I could clearly see the rising hill the town sat upon. I held up my thumb over the entire front gate before deciding I had already gone probably over a mile. I wiped beads of sweat with the back of a hand before spinning to continue my journey. The trees loomed in front of the narrow path. They'd grown black and thick, steadily increasing until they looked to be no more than a wall of giants the way was swallowed by. I slowed as I neared the mouth of the massive forest, letting my feet sink into the soft dirt beneath them. I looked over my shoulder to see the town as a small speckle, sparkling in the spreading sunlight. This is the furthest I've ever been. The thought sank in with building excitement. A trickle of fear grew beneath it as a breeze rustled the bushes surrounding the entrance like a taunt. Better hurry. That little Ness is a quick one, and you're already on her list. Buck's words echoed at my heels as I lifted them one after another, forcing them forward. The sunshine leaked through the forest canopy, lighting my way as I blinked and rubbed my eyes into submission. After a moment of readjusting, I could see the path a little more clearly. as it moved forward in front of me. "Follow it to the clearing, boy. You'll know it when you see it." I rushed over the way as quickly and quietly as I could, trying my best not to disturb whatever might be hiding from my sight. I thought of the wolves I'd heard howling in the distance on calm summer nights. Suddenly, I felt less sure of myself. I'd never seen one close up, but I had seen the aftermath of their being among the town's sheep. I gulped, moving forward cautiously, but quickly, until through the thick surroundings, I could hear the sound of familiar animals. Chickens. A goose honked, followed by another and another. Relief. I felt it pouring over me as I rushed headlong into the clearing Buck had promised I'd find. I stopped short to catch my breath and take in the surroundings with my hands heavily resting on my knees. Oof, that wasn't so bad. A warm light flickered from the front window of the cozy cottage. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney above it. It swirled in around itself in billows that crept slowly to the canopy, as if it was in no hurry to go anywhere fast. The space surrounding was fenced and full of all kinds of things. All kinds of plants and flowers burst around the back of the little house, poking through the wire fence, which I assumed kept small animals from their fruits and blossoms. What a nice place, I thought, stepping in closer. Geese, ducks, chickens, a mule, a few goats, some sheep, and a cow grazed over the front lawn of the little meadow. It's like a little oasis. My heart leapt with excitement, all fears forgotten. On each of the fence corners, there was a large lantern, much like the beacons on the watchtowers surrounding the city walls. "Ah, Bessie Daisy Jr., you big dum-dum, why'd you go and stick your hoof in the bucket again?" I almost jumped out of my skin as I turned to face the animals in the front once more. My eyes flung themselves immediately to the black and white spotted cow, chewing lazily on a mouthful of grass. I turned my head to the side and squatted closer to the ground. I could see a small figure sitting on the other side of the large animal. The cow looked back and mooed as if in response. I laughed in response to the exchange, and immediately the animals all shifted their attention in my direction. The geese honked wildly as they waddled to the fence line, anticipating my approach. "Who's that?" the girl's voice cried out. "Must be Nessy." My heart raced. Oh, she was already upset with me for being later than expected, and I'd poked the bear by laughing at the scene. She probably saw it all wrong. I stepped forward. "Nessy, is that you?" She grunted and raised herself up from the ground she'd fallen into. I could see the red hood and cloak I noticed from the shadows of the waking town. It was definitely her. Without answering, she stood up and walked around the front of the cow. Her frown said enough, but the splash of mud covering the bottom of her cloak and clinging to her front curls suggested I should probably just keep my mouth shut. I smiled, unsure of what else to do. Her frown deepened. "Oh, real funny, huh?" She tossed the bucket from her hand and stooped to the ground, picking a wet dirt clod from her boot. She walked straight toward the fence, and I followed suit, closing the gap without thinking much about her actions. Without warning, she lifted her hand full of muck and tossed it straight in my face. Gross! Oh, my mouth was open. I spit and coughed the cool, mulchy mud out of my mouth. It clung to my eyelids as I launched gritty dirt and wiped it away as best as I could. all the while my own blood getting hot. The taste of earth and other things clung to my tongue and teeth mercilessly. "Oh, don't be a baby," she laughed. Now I was the one frowning and squinting against the invasive gunk all over my face. When I finally recovered sight, the twinkle in her eye and satisfaction painted over her face ignited full-blown anger. Without thinking, I stooped to dig beneath the grass. I pulled up a clod and tossed it with all my might in her direction. She squealed and rushed toward the gathering flock of geese, scattering them in all directions as they squawked more loudly than before. The chickens had begun to join into the chorus chaotically. I jumped into pursuit, still not satisfied. I stooped at the other side of the fence to grab up another chunk of wet ground and moldable mud. I formed it between my hands as I rushed after her. What a brat, I thought as I rounded the cow. The heifer she'd called Bessie seemed to be watching us with more interest, though she didn't make a move to get out of the crossfire. I made it to the other side of the beast, in time to see the edge of Nessy's red and brown cloak disappearing at the other end. Her gleeful squeals made me more angry by the second. I turned on my heels in the hopes that I might catch her off guard, but she did the same. So when I reached the other side of Bessie, I had the same view as I did before, her disappearing. Arrgh! My next logical move, if I can't get what I want going around, maybe over will work. I leapt to the top of Bessie in an effort to attack from above, and just as the clod of dirt left my hand, Bessie leapt into action, tossing me into the air as she mooed more loudly, and ran straight for the wooden fence standing between the animals and the surrounding forest. Together we smashed through the barrier, me hoisted over her back, helplessly, and she running headlong toward the edge of the clearing. I heard Nessy hollering a warning as the cow came to an abrupt halt, kicking up her hind legs, just enough to send me flying toward the front row of oaks, standing firm before us. The last thing I heard was a heavy thud. I blinked my eyes awake to find myself surrounded in the softest blankets I'd ever felt. There was something rumbling on my chest. A steady hum and pressure rattled comfortingly on top of me. He's awake! I recognized the voice immediately, though the throbbing in my head caused me to squint my eyes closed as best as I could. The light felt blinding. I felt a cold hand rest over my forehead, automatically soothing the angry heat to a dull roar. Oh. Mima, he's awake! Ow! Was all I could manage to say. Oh, I'm sorry, she whispered more quietly. I brought my hand to my head. It was wrapped in a thick gauze material. The pressure of it sank in as a cold brass mug touched my palm. I closed my fingers around it. Strangely, the throbbing in my head stopped. I blinked rapidly, letting my eyes adjust to the warm flicker of lamplight and open window curtains. I looked to my side, seeing a much more friendly version of my nemesis's face. I glared slowly, determined not to let her ruin my chances at working for Buck. Now, there's no need to scowl. Didn't your mother teach you? The worst faces, and the best ones, are the ones that often stick. The ethereal voice sank in from what seemed like all around me. I'd never heard such a thing before. I shook my head, releasing the frown at the thought of it. What happened? I groaned, sounding more pathetic than I'd meant to. I took a drink from the sweating glass. The ice tinked against the sides of their container. The sound of it made me feel at home, comforted. As the coolness ran through my mouth and down my throat, it nearly numbed my tongue to tingling. It felt funny, which made me smile. I opened my eyes, feeling much better, even after the first small sip. "Thanks for the water," I mumbled. "It isn't just regular water, you know," Nessy whispered, tossing the statement between us like a fishing line and baited hook. "What do you mean?" I whispered back. I could barely taste anything over the ice cold, but breathing through my nose slowly, I caught the most pleasant essence. It reminded me of the steam of the fresh baked goods back at the waypoint. The warm butter and cinnamon had led me by the nose straight to the front entrance of right where I was meant to go. I opened my eyes and looked curiously at the wide eyes of my new nemesis. It's hard to be mad when curiosity is around. It has a way of bringing boldness with it wherever it's most potent. "Can you guess what's in it?" she conspired quietly. I breathed out through my nose one more time. Something flowery and... Oh, come on. It's so obvious. Nessy rolled her eyes at me, as if I should know exactly what the mysterious ingredient was. I caught my frown midway, and then released it with more vigor. "Oh, sorry." She dropped her eyes for a moment before perking up again. "It's lavender and cucumber from the garden, and honey from the hives. Oh, and limes from the orchards," she finished with a satisfied smile. "Is there something mint?" I suggested, remembering the numbness in my tongue. Her eyes widened. Yes, there is. That's from the garden also." A larger shadow appeared from behind the glowing hearth with a sweating pitcher. I gulped down the last of the stuff in my glass. "Thank you, miss," I nodded respectfully. The woman of the woods chuckled as she stooped briefly with her back turned toward us to prod at the fire with a long steel poker. Her laughter sounded like a bubbling brook paired with a light breeze over the reeds surrounding it. I lifted myself and settled back into the headboard, bringing the cat who'd been purring on my chest to rest in my lap. I drew my cup to rest on the cat as I waited patiently for her to refill my glass from the pitcher of special water. The mysterious figure walked into the light. She was surprisingly different than Buck had described her. I was expecting a long-nosed hag with translucent skin, maybe even blue-tinted from the lack of sunlight it was met with. And she appeared different than any person I'd ever met, as if she might not even be a human at all. She reminded me of a wise old oak, yet her face was gracefully ageless. I couldn't keep the smile from traveling over my face to match hers. Such luck in 2 days. 2 new teachers. All at once, but I couldn't decide what this mentor would bring. Buck sounded obvious to me, but she, a complete mystery. The lady extended the pitcher, and my hand felt almost compelled to move in unison, to meet in the middle. The water flowing from the mouth of the vase sounded as if it were thanking us for partaking. "Thank you," I offered, as the last drop passed from one to the other. She offered the pitcher to Nessy, who eagerly did the same, leaping to her feet to wrap her arms around the woman's waist. "Mima, I'm so sorry about the fence," she lamented. "I take full responsibility. I started it. I threw muck right in his face." She released her grip and backed toward the bed between us. She looked to the ground as if the weight of the impending disappointment might crush her from too close up. Nessy kicked a bare big toe into the wooden floor, as the one she called Mima chuckled again. "Oh, now, the animals can care for themselves while the two of you have a break." She smiled at both of us, eyes full of mischief before continuing. "But then it's up to you to find and collect every last one of my little ones before you head back for the afternoon. Buck will be expecting you, so once I let you loose, be wise with your time." My heart suddenly lurched. It's my first day on the job, and I already let myself go. I'd gotten angry, and it made me stupid, and my stupidity had made such a mess of things. The sound of the fence breaking against Bessie's strong chest echoed through me. "Oh no," I groaned out loud. The two shifted to look at me, expecting a follow-up of some kind. "Buck is gonna get rid of me before my first day is even over. I'm the worst apprentice ever." My smile sank to my feet, leaving a frown in its place as it backed away from me. The lady of the forest smiled at Ness. Nessy looked from her to me, slightly worried also, at first. Then she began to smile too. "I can hurry back and tell Buck what happened. I'll tell him it was all my fault. He'll understand, just you wait. Buck always understands." She nodded at her own words, convinced of their rightness before she'd even finished. The woman smiled. She placed the picture on the small nightstand near the place where I sat. "That's a wonderful idea, Nessy. But here's another option. Why don't I send him a message with our good friend Beatty and save you the trouble of running all that way? Our new friend here doesn't know his way around these forests like you do. You also know how many of each animal there are, and that's a lot to learn in a single day, wouldn't you say?" Nessy's eyes widened. "Oh, that's a great idea. Yes, I'll start right away. I'm okay. I'll go start now. Maybe he should rest for a while." She raised an eyebrow as she tapped at my head wrap. Ouch! I suddenly remembered what had started this whole mess to begin with. I leveled her with a frown. "Both of you sit." Nessy crawled back into her chair. I remained where I was, sitting upright on the bed, petting my new furry little friend, still purring happily. I studied my newest mentor's face. It was kind but firm in expression, as if she were about to teach an important lesson. I listened intently as she continued. "I've lived in these forests for quite some time." She smiled secretively, spreading her hands in both directions to broaden the effectiveness of the story with her gestures. I leaned in. "I've seen a lot of life pass through the valleys. You can only imagine the travelers who found their way to my doorstep. I won't give you pictures of their conditions." She was looking directly at me, as if what she was saying in that statement was for only me. I glanced from the corner of my eye to see Nessy nodding her head somberly. The look in her eye was distant, as if she were experiencing a completely different moment than I was. A memory, maybe? My curiosity piqued, and I looked to see the kind woman waiting patiently for my attention before she went on again. My cheeks burnt at my behavior, but she only smiled, beginning where she left off. "By the time they reach you and walk the streets of your city, they've become, well, more themselves again." Her eyes flashed warning. "There are things in this world that are priceless, and others that are more perilous than you might think." Her soft voice comforted me, like wind through the willow trees. She waved a finger between us. "Both are as useful and important as the other, and I'm fully convinced that one is nothing if the other doesn't exist." I frowned, trying to wrap my mind around what she'd said. Before it could process, she dove in again. I have a story for you, if you're interested. Nessy and I nodded vigorously in unison. The woman beamed down. Nessy, why don't you go grab those delicious baked cakes Buck sent with you? Let's enjoy them before they're cold. I gasped. The donuts. Miss? I stammered. Call me Grady. Or Meemaw. She smiled at Nessy as she offered the second option. Grady. I tried it out. It was fitting for some reason. As if it had always been. Have you seen the satchel I brought with me? I asked. Grady frowned, glancing around. I don't believe that I have. She looked to Nessy again, who was already making her way back from the table with the cakes stacked on a large periwinkle platter she'd balanced between her hands. Light from the fire reflected warmly through the stained glass, casting little rainbow lights to shimmer all around us. It reminded me of the firebugs I'd caught in the meadow so many summers ago. Dear one, did you happen to see his satchel while you dragged him to my doorstep? I imagined Nessy pulling me by my arms while I flopped unconsciously. I could only imagine the faces I'd made. I grimaced. You're heavier than you look, the girl murmured, holding the tray out to Grandy first. She took a chocolate-drizzled scone and nodded gratefully. Nessy placed the tray between us and climbed back into her chair, eagerly waiting for the story to begin. She grabbed hold of her glass and folded her legs in around themselves, completely ignoring the plate of food I couldn't take my eyes from. I reached for one hungrily, and, taking the first bite, my eyelids sank. Suddenly, I was back at the Waypoint kitchen, surrounded in the wonderful smells. It seemed like so long ago. I opened my eyes and looked back to a smiling Grandy. She nodded in agreement. I know, these are my favorite. I don't often go to town, but good Buck has made sure I never go a day without them. Bless his heart. Grandy chuckled. Taking a bite, she closed her eyes the same way I had. I found myself smiling again, all worries of losing my position fading into nothing. I felt like I was among old friends. Okay, now where were we? Ah yes, the story. She finished her bite and placed the plate on her armrest, bringing her hands to rest gently together beneath her chin. Once upon a story time, there was a nest full of featherless. There was a nest full of featherless bluebird hatchlings. Now these hatchlings started out very strange looking. Just a lump of tissues to be molded through the nurturing only a parent can give. With each day they basked in the shaded sun. With each meal they ate under the watchful eye of their loved one. Every night they spent huddled beneath the safety of their father and mother in turns. The young hatchlings would wake and emerge from their parents' plumage, looking more and more like them. In time, little spindles and pinions showed through the first layers of fuzz. As the four grew, the nest grew more cramped, and as their parents would go out in search of food, a single one of the bunch began making an advance. Out to the branch he would hop, clumsily hoping to maintain his footing while testing the integrity of the way. He would sit bravely on the furthest reach of the spindly branch, just watching. His eyes slowly adjusted to the distance of the expansive meadow resting beyond the safety of their bough. Over time, this little bird became accustomed to his routine. He no longer doubted the footing of his route as he hopscotched nimbly to the outskirts of the branch they lived on. His brother and sisters laughed at him, telling him someday he'd slip and look silly. Someday he was bound to trip and fall all the way from the branch to the grate beneath, lost forever. Thankfully, that day never came, and the little rogue became more assured of his feet daily. And no matter how bad they heckled him, the little fledgling would come back at the end of the day and relay all the wonderful things he'd seen taking place. He'd tell them of soaring things like their parents, only bigger, and how they would lift higher and higher into the sky until they completely disappeared from view. He'd unravel threads, following things full of fuzz like the stuff in their first coats. But instead of these, he'd say while flapping his still developing wings, "They have 2 more of these," he said, again lifting each of his legs toward his siblings. At this, they all cringed, each imagining how awful and strange 2 more legs coming out where their arms were, and the images were quite scary. Since they hadn't seen them for themselves, they could only imagine. They began having nightmares of such creatures climbing the trees to get them. And, in turn, the wild bluebird fledgling was chastised by his parents for telling such horrible things to his siblings. But he'd only ever told them things he'd seen. Wonderful things. Not the things of nightmares, but the best of dreams. After describing them again to his parents, they both laughed. "Why, those are just the valley critters. They're beneath us, yes. They're our first line of defense. In fact, they keep our predators away from us. Don't bother yourself with them. There's a reason that we have wings to rise above such things." At this, the little bluebird was confused. They seemed like such wonderful critters. They sped around the meadows, adding spark and color and life to the space surrounding them, breaking up the solid green seas just by being. He'd watched fondly as they followed their curiosities from one side of the meadow to the other, stopping long enough to nibble at the blossoms along their way. He often found himself longing to be among them, learning to hop about as quickly as they seemed to. That night, the little one sat awake, staring off into the distant stars above. A new question had formed and was keeping him from sleeping. What made the fuzzy critters he'd grown so fond of from so far off any less important than a winged creature? And what were these mysterious predators or monsters they'd spoken of with such fear? The next day, the youngest of the growing hatchlings' first full feather had pushed forward into full bloom. He'd been so excited, he'd sang a joyful song the rest of the morning, leaping and hopping from twig to twig along the rim of the nest to trumpet his good fortune. The oldest of the 4 fledglings sat crossly in the center of the nest, glaring at the first full feather branching from his small brother. He grew more and more heated at the littlest of them's apparent pride and in what he'd had nothing to do with. He watched and watched and watched. Without thinking, he'd edged his way closer to the ledge of the nest, and while their sisters watched eagerly for their next meal, he plucked a stick from the nest and tossed it right into his brother's path. The joyful fledgling looked down too late, and to his terror, the worst-case scenario became his apparent fate. With a fearful "reet" and a surprised "tweet," he fell fast to the grass at the base of their family's tree. The bed of moss was still wet from the morning dew. Its spongy state patted the little creature's fall, as if it too had watched his bold progression and assumed someday, just someday, the fall might be an inevitability. "Thank you for catching me," the fledgling peeped as he hopped far enough off to be sure nothing had been injured in the process. To his relief, he felt fine, except for being so far from everything he'd ever known. He peeped up toward the nest, resting somewhere above the lowest branches, and out of his sight. His chirps were returned with silence. He hopped a bit further, hoping to catch his siblings' attention. He peeped again as he went. And somewhere along the process of hopping into deeper grasses, he'd grown more excited. It can be scary later, he thought, for now he was in the open grass in broad daylight. The blades tickled against his face gently, as if begging him to play. The little fledgling hopped this way and that, suddenly aware of creatures lying just beneath the grass's surface. They were the same long, bow-legged critters that their parents would bring back to the nest at mealtime. He'd never seen them so animated. The little fledgling watched in awe as he gathered in the sounds they seemed to be making with their long legs. "Hello," he said, stooping down closer.
"Please, please,"
the critter cried out, terrified at the shadow looming over the grass line like a strange, semi-feathered giant.
"Please don't eat me."
The bird was surprised. The idea of eating something so alive seemed silly, seeing the beautiful melody it had been stringing and strumming along so naturally made it seem like so much more than food. Grandy paused to fill our glasses, looking intently from my face to Nessy's with deepening gratification. "What do you think so far?" she asked, as I held out my cup for seconds. "Good! It's so good!" Nessy cried, clapping. "Keep going," she emphasized, before adding, "Please, Mima, keep going." The woman chuckled. She glanced my way. "And what do you say?" "I like it." She cocked her head to the side, waiting for me to say more. "But I don't get it. Why would his brother do that?" I was annoyed with the transition. If I had a brother, I would want him to get his wings, even if it was before me. I'd be a great brother. I thought I would, anyway. Well, dearest, nature has a way of following its course to the fullest progression, with or without our assistance. I think to understand you'll need more experience, but always know life finds a way, always. You'll see. Her eyes twinkled with excitement as she went on. So then, the little fledgling had made its first friend. For the rest of the day, the little grasshopper rode around on his patchy feathered back, teaching the little bird all about the meadow as he knew it. The fledgling learned about the fuzzy critters he'd watched for so many days on end. Rabbits, bunnies, hares, mighty soaring fur giants with careless giant feet. They were known as many things, apparently, each name specific to the creature who'd interacted with them or had known someone who had. By the end of that first afternoon of the fledgling's big adventure, he was more determined than ever to stray far enough into the meadow that he might find one of these bunnies for himself. Maybe they could help him get back to his family, so far up in the tree above. He told his new friend about his desire, and both set off excitedly. The grasshopper to request that the rabbits be more aware of the little folk beneath them while they hopped around, and the hatchling just excited at the idea of meeting his favorite things. The two roamed until the light began to fade. The cool night air pinched and bit against the still developing little fledgling's wings, causing him to shake and shiver. The two found a small pair of bushes, and together they fell asleep between the cover of thick leaves to the sound of the grasshopper's peaceful melody playing on repeat. The next morning found them fast asleep. The little chick had slept more restfully than he had in recent memory, his dreams full of adventures, and his waking moments electrified by the first rays of dawn that had leaked in through their covering to warm them. The little bird stretched, only to find a whole bunch of new forever feathers gracing his wings. He hopped and sang in happy circles with his new friend, feeling stronger than ever and more determined to find these rabbits. The little grasshopper leapt on his back, playing along and whooping and hollering with the little bird. Secretly, he wondered how long it would be before the little thing grew hungry.
You know,
He chirped as they went along.
your kind also eats things called worms. Are you hungry?
He asked slyly. The bird replied that he was, and so together they hopped toward the sound of the sprightly brook he'd seen from the nest, unraveling in both directions to disappear into the thick tree lines beyond the meadow. The little bird hopped quickly in the direction the grasshopper prompted him to go, stopping only when they'd reached the soft, muddy ground surrounding the little river.
Look over the edge. That's where you'll find them.
The grasshopper called.
You'll find a ton of worms right on the other side of the hump.
In a blink, the little bird lost his balance. Flailing his useless wings, he toppled headlong into the rapidly rushing torrents. When he resurfaced, he heard the joyful chirping of his companion. He struggled and fought to keep his head above water, only to find the backstabbing thing hopping rapidly along with him, cackling.
Your kind can't be changed. All you do is eat we grass dwellers. At least the rabbits are simply clumsy. Your kind is the reason my mother is gone. This valley will be better off with at least one less of you. Toodaloo! Good riddance.
His voice faded as he slowed to a halt, leaving the poor little bird vaulting over sharp rocks and bumping into fallen tree limbs stuck deep into them. A desperate cry escaped him above the water's surface, and in the same breath, an especially strong current swept him up and on top of a fallen log. The little bluebird, again lost and hurt by this second betrayal from one he'd grown to trust. It had all left him peeping sadly between the log's soggy branches he'd sought shelter between. His hunger was forgotten in the deepening twilight as evening approached the wooded arena. The poor little bird could barely feel his little feet through the cold. He could barely feel the cold causing him to shiver through the realization that he was lost, far from home, and all alone. The sound of water thundering around him had once excited him, but in the aftermath of the day he'd had, that same sound now invited in a feeling of horror. The little fledgling shook as the forest turned to pitch black. He ruffled up his feathers as best as he could, ready to stay right where he was until the cold swallowed him up completely. What if while he was moving along the log he fell back in? That would be the end of him. The what-ifs were enough to keep the poor little bird from moving a single muscle. He fell into an exhausted hibernation. Long before dawn, a new sound woke the fledgling. The loud hissing and whispers, passing between two increasingly heated strangers, alerted the little bird, letting him know he was no longer alone. He blinked, trying to adjust his sight to the darkness. Two white geese nipped lightly back and forth, bickering like a pair of brothers. Cheep! Cheep! The wretched little thing peeped weakly from the soggy branches he'd wedged himself between for safekeeping. "Huh? Did you hear that?" the first goose questioned. I did! I heard it for sure. What do you think it might be?" squawked the other, excitedly on repeat, until the first nipped out at him in annoyance. Shh! Shh! You might wake up the entire neighborhood. How rude you are sometimes, Gretchen. "I've told you, Petey," the first snapped in a loud whisper. "It's goose ganterism smism, and it's a condition." She nipped back fast with a hiss. "Who's rude now?" They exchanged heated honks, all the while moving closer. The little bird wedged between the two branches wriggled free, hopping out on the limb with unadulterated curiosity. Maybe his little heart picked up, beating more rapidly. Maybe these two will be different than the rest, he thought. "Cheep! Cheep!" he cried again. The honking fell silent. See that, Gretchen? You never stopped talking, so we missed it again. And who knows when we might hear it next, huh? Who know? Cheep! 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 The little bird spoke up again, more forcefully this time. He gathered the last of his bravery, hopping forward just a smidgen and into plain sight. The gathering dawn, breaking its first light above the rushing brook, broke over the little bird. And, in the light, the fledgling saw something he'd never seen before. Birds with wings much bigger than anything he'd ever seen. Their beaks were as big as he was. He peeped and hopped away in surprise, losing his footing in the process. He toppled again into the water. As he sank and tumbled, he closed his eyes. Too tired and weak to fight the current, he let himself go with the flow of it. The woman of the woods paused again, glancing outside the window before she stood and made her way to the sill. She opened the curtains and looked around the front of the clearing. Her eyes rested on the break in the fence line. "All right," she clapped her hands merrily before rubbing them against one another. "Now let's get these animals gathered up, shall we?" I couldn't believe my ears and nearly tossed my cup into the air as I began to protest. "But Grandy!" I couldn't contain my excitement. I looked toward Nessy with disbelief, begging her silently to finish the sentiment for me. But she was biting her lip and doing her best to hold back what I'd failed to. Finally she laughed, shaking her head. All right, no point in fighting it." She hopped obediently from her seat. "But," I stammered, unsure of what to say in order to convince the lady to give just the smallest bit of information on what would happen next. "Miss Grandy," I began again. "Just Grandy, dear one," she sang out over her shoulder. She walked the pitcher into the next room, disappearing behind its median of walls. "But Grandy, that isn't how a story ends," I cried, kicking the blanket from my feet. I rushed to follow her, tripping over myself as I went. "What happened to the little bird? Was it the geese he'd met? Do they save him? Do they become good friends? Do they take him back to his parents?" I stopped in my tracks as she turned to meet my eager gaze. "Well," she teased, "you are right about the first thing." She winked. "The story is far from over, which means the little bird is far from dead and remains very much alive for quite some time, as you'll come to see, if you're patient and bear with the story." She smiled secretively before turning away. "Now get your shoes. Don't leave little Nessy to clean up your mess all by herself." I felt better, knowing it wasn't the end of the little bird. I liked to think that after everything it had been through, something good would come from it. Maybe the geese would adopt him, and he could give them a reason to argue less and laugh and play more. Maybe the geese never see him again, and something different, a turtle maybe. Something, anything, was going to save him. I felt better knowing it wasn't the end of his story, and the potential outcomes continued pouring into my mind as I put my shoes on one foot at a time. The thoughts followed me to the door of the cottage and out over the clearing. I'd walked myself all the way to the smashed fence before stopping in my tracks, the faraway stare gleaming from my own eye as I realized maybe, just maybe, that hunger for more, the sensation of not having the entire thing, maybe that was the essence of a good story. Like the baked goods made by Buck. They have a way of sticking to the roof of your mouth and writing themselves into memory so vividly the thought of them fills every sense full of something related when they're brought to mind. I took in a deep breath, immediately forgetting the thought. The smell of cool moss mixed with lilacs and wet leaves caught me up in a cool breeze as my heart started beating more quickly. Maybe this was the beginning of the perfect story. To be continued.